Well, it is 4 o'clock on the dot, so I say we will get started. I'd like to welcome you to the May Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety seminar. I'm really pleased to have all of you here. We have a great speaker. Before we get started, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items. So you will have received a notification when you signed in. This seminar is being recorded. All participants are muted. So if you have questions for our speaker during the presentation, please use the chat function. And at the end of the seminar, we will collect those and we will pose them for some Q&A at the end. And then importantly, we do have Spanish interpretation available. So for those of you who are interested in having the presentation presented in Spanish, please select the interpretation symbol down at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a globe, and then select Spanish. Okay, so our next slide, please. I am really pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Phil Martin from UC Davis. He is going to speak about California farm labor and all that is changing, and perhaps those things that are not. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Phil, and look forward to hearing the presentation.
Well, thank you, Heather. And I want to thank everyone, Heather and colleagues. And I want to thank everyone for joining on a Monday afternoon, on a windy Monday afternoon, to take a quick look at California farm labor in 2021. That means we're going to look back a little bit as to what happened in 2019 and especially in 2020, and look ahead as to what kinds of things are changing. So now I can share my screen, and here we go. And hopefully everybody can see my screen. So the first thing to remember is that in 2020, average employment in California agriculture was slightly lower than it was in 2019. We normally have an average employment about 425,000. That means you take a snapshot every month, add up employment, divide by.
The main three things that we're going to talk about are the pandemic changed both the demand for and the supply of workers. The demand for workers tended to be very similar because most of the perennial crops were harvested, but some vegetable crops were not planted since there was less demand from restaurants and other things. The COVID outbreak, of course, turned out to be much more severe in food processing and meat packing than on farms. There were outbreaks among H2A workers who were housed in motels in California, and communities in ag areas had very high prevalence rates in some cases. But the real story was that there were not the big farm labor shortages that some people expected in 2020. COVID accelerated trends that were already underway in agriculture, and that's the main takeaway from today. There was more labor-saving mechanization, more H2A workers, and more imports of fruits and vegetables. If we go to the next slide, you can see that California ag employment declined differently in different counties. Monterey declined the most, and that makes sense because Monterey County has a higher share of annual crops that did not have to be planted if the demand from food service buyers wasn't there. Next slide. There are several ways to look at ag employment, and it's entirely possible that in the end, we may find that the employment did not drop as much as what was anticipated in 2020. Next slide. The US seems to be turning a corner on COVID after the February peak, so things are slowly getting back to normal. But the main impact of COVID has been to raise production costs as employers invested more in protective personal equipment, not as much density in housing, special transportation arrangements. It's probably important to remember that there was some investment in masks and gloves before COVID for food safety reasons. Next slide. Many employers try to ensure that workers work in groups or pods so that if there was an outbreak, that it would not shut down their entire operation. it would only affect one particular crew rather than their entire workforce. Next slide. The farm workforce is aging. It's still, according to the National Ag Worker Survey, still about half unauthorized, but increasingly it consists of workers who are settled in the United States with US-born children. Next slide. Most of the unauthorized workers have US-born children, and in most cases, the children of farm workers educated in the US do not follow their parents into the fields to fill seasonal farm jobs. The NAS finds that most current farm workers, next slide, would like to continue in agriculture. And the question is, with the average age of workers in the NAS being now roughly 42, which is about the median age for all US workers, the question is, how much longer will those workers continue to do farm work? Will there be the introduction of a lot of things like platforms that take up the lifting and carrying out of agriculture so that workers can do farm work longer? Or will there have to be some other mechanism, or will the normal idea was it's hard to find a farmer under 40 because of the investment that's required to get into agriculture, hard to find a farm worker who's over 40 because of the physical demands of the job. Next slide. There were lots of predictions of farm labor shortages that would lead to unpicked apples and lettuce and other crops due to sick farm workers. By and large, that did not happen in 2020. So most of the early estimates, including some that were made here by people at UCD, did not happen. That is, we did not have near the amount of, we did not have the crop losses due to lack of workers that some people expected. There were issues with there were sick workers, to be sure, but there weren't large crop losses. Next slide. In the California Farm Bureau did a survey and found that 3 out of 4 farm employers said that they had no days lost to COVID. And among those that did have days lost to COVID, most of them were relatively short. Next slide. So we now should be looking at COVID outbreaks in food and meat processing. And the point that's made here is just that the COVID was much more of an issue in meat packing, especially, where workers work close together in cold and wet areas than it was in the fields. So food packing and meat packing turned out to be a place where there were far more issues than in farm work per se. Next slide. We did have the COVID outbreaks often among H2A workers who are often housed 4 to a room in bunk beds in motels. So it's not as if there was no COVID among farm workers. There was, but it wasn't in the same concentration or the same way that was expected when predictions were made at the beginning of 2020. So we go to the next slide. You all know that the risk of COVID is primarily a function of age. And so we're now at the stage where we make the transition from talking about COVID in 2020 to what comes next. So this is the slide of California has a $15 minimum wage. Next year, it's $14. This year, $14 an hour. And the question is really, will the federal government join California and other states in raising the minimum wage for $15 an hour? Keep in mind that next year, that is in 2022, if the federal government does not act, the minimum wage in California will be more than twice as high as the minimum wage in other states, some other states that have a $7.25 an hour minimum wage. Next slide. The main takeaway from today is that there were the trends underway before COVID that were accelerated by COVID. And so this is true not just in agriculture. There were trends underway throughout the economy that were accelerated by COVID. It's true of remote work arrangements. It's true of automation in general, or using IT or artificial intelligence to do work. But the big three items accelerated by COVID were labor saving mechanization, H2A workers, more H2A guest workers, and more imports of labor intensive fruits and vegetables. Next slide. The idea of labor saving mechanization is an old story. We all know that in the first census in 1790, 95% of Americans lived in rural areas dependent on agriculture. Today, it's about 1.5%. So the story of agricultural history and human history is that machines replace people in the fields. And next slide. And we've mechanized the harvest of a lot of commodities in California. We've mechanized the harvest of many commodities that people said would be very difficult to mechanize. The interesting thing about looking at the debates over mechanization, particularly processing tomatoes, since the plant was changed and the machine was developed here at UC Davis, the interesting prediction was how wrong the people who were close to the issue in the early 1960s were as to how long it would take. Many people thought it would take 20 or 30 years. In fact, the processing tomato harvest was mechanized in about 7 or 8 years. It happened very quickly once they developed a uniformly ripening tomato, had a slightly different shape, and a machine to cut the tomato plants and shake the tomatoes off of those plants. The big issue with mechanization, next slide, the big issue with mechanization in agriculture is this issue of performance versus costs. A lot of the labor mechanization or robotics work is done at places like Carnegie Mellon, and the military finances an awful lot of labor-saving robotic devices. And for the military, the basic issue is performance. If you can save a soldier, you spend millions of dollars. In agriculture, it's much more about cost. The machine has to be durable, has to be cheap. It doesn't necessarily have to get all the apples that are on that particular tree. The little plant mover for nurseries, the original model was over $100,000. This particular model that works 24/7 is down to about $20,000. It's durable, it's fairly simple to operate, and that seems to be the rule in agricultural mechanization. The need to have durability and low cost, and not be performance, yes, but not performance if the cost is going to be a lot higher. Next slide. Then the question is, what's next for mechanization? In order to mechanize the harvest of crops, you have to sort of plan from the very beginning. The plants have to be planted in a way that one can, so that you're thinking from the very beginning, how do we organize this particular commodity so that instead of picking by hand, we will pick it by machine. And there's several approaches that should and could be complementary here. We could focus on biology, that is, we could aim for uniform ripening. That's the biggest problem with mechanizing many crops, that if they don't ripen uniformly, it's much more difficult for a machine to pick them. If they ripen uniformly, then what can happen is the machine can destroy the plant, and that makes it far easier for the machine to work. And I think if I can share my screen, I think I'm now back. So if you allow me, I'll
unmute my speaker and share my screen. you might be able to see me again. And you'll tell me if this is working and you can see me. Does it work?
Kent, Phil, it's working perfectly. Welcome back, and you have all control now.
Okay, I will stop the phone, and I apologize for all that. I'm not sure what it was, but here's where we were. We had gone through and said COVID speeded up changes that were already happening. And now the question is,
Okay, you're live again.
Okay, here I am live. Well, for some reason, something doesn't like me, and I wind up being frozen, even on this on this machine. So we're talking about what's next for mechanization. The big question: it's going to cost money, and the question is, where do you invest? Does one invest in biology? And try to get this uniform ripening so you can do once over harvesting, or do you invest in engineering, use a lot of cameras and artificial intelligence to locate and selectively pick fruits and vegetables? And back in the 1960s, there was a lot of federal and state investment in mechanization. Now it's much more private investment. Universities often do the basic research, but then the private sector develops themselves. So mechanization is a work in progress. The difference between the 1960s and now is there's a lot of venture capital, but it's going to take a huge investment. It means thinking about planting trees to make fruiting walls rather than big round trees. It means thinking from beginning about how to harvest a particular commodity. And the intermediate step could be many more mechanical aids. That is, make hand workers more productive. You've all seen conveyor belts that go in front of workers, that reduces the carrying that has to occur. There are in development robots that will move flats of strawberries from individual pickers to the end of the row to get credit. There are hydraulic platforms that are replacing ladders. So there is an effort for mechanization. There's also an effort for mechanical aids that make hand workers more productive. If we go to the next slide, you can see some of the mechanical aids that are in development. The apple fruiting wall is the idea that you are planning from the beginning to be able to harvest these machines either with those mechanical aids or with a machine. The robotic little burros that move lugs table grapes from pickers to packers at the end of the row take a lot of the wheelbarrow carrying out of doing that particular job. Next slide. Up in the state of Washington, where there's a lot of tree fruit, there's this effort to get rid of ladders. So when people are working from ladders, most studies show that they spend anywhere from a fourth to a third of their time just moving and positioning the ladder. And people do work from top to bottom, but nonetheless, setting up ladders on uneven ground can be dangerous and lead to falls. This is a Bandit Express, cost about $60,000. And as you can see, there are several workers that work on the platform. There's also several workers that work from the ground. There is a difference in the wage system because now the workers are sharing a piece rate to pick into bins, whereas before, when they were in ladders, they were picking into their individual bins. So the idea of labor-saving mechanization and then productivity-enhancing mechanization are things that are in play and will likely have been accelerated by COVID. Next slide. The H2A program is growing. There are about 1.1 million year-round equivalent jobs in crop agriculture. And last year, about 10% of those jobs were filled by H2A guest workers. So the average guest worker, H2A worker, is in the US for 6 months, and it takes roughly 220,000 individual guest workers to get 110,000 full-time equivalent workers. So we're roughly halfway. We're at 10% of crop workers being H2A workers. We're halfway to what braceros were in the mid-1950s. And at the peak in 1956, 1 out of 5 U.S. farm workers was a bracero. Now it's about 1 out of 10 that's an H2A worker. Next slide. You know that in order to employ H2A workers, employers must pay a so-called adverse effect wage rate, which in California in 2021 is a little over $16, a little higher in Oregon and Washington. But the important point is that the adverse effect wage rate is higher than the state or federal minimum wage. And it's much higher on the West Coast. It's higher in those Midwestern states in dark red, because that's where Canadian combine crews come down with big equipment and they harvest wheat from south to north with the season. But in the Southeast, the A work is the lowest, and that's where most of the H2A workers are. Next slide. We're going to look at H2A contracts in fiscal year 20, and we don't really know how much H2A workers earn, because H2A workers, as we know, are in the US an average of about 6 months, but the employer specifies an hours per week that he expects to offer work. He only has to pay, the employer has to only pay for 3/4 of the value of the contract. And of course, the employer can offer more hours of work and the worker can agree to accept it. So instead of working 38 or 39 hours a week, the worker could be working 50 or 55 hours a week. But if you look at what the contracts offer, you can see that the average worker across the United States is earning about $12,500, a little more in California, a little less in Florida. And the reason for those differences between states has to do with the A work and the amount of time worked. Next slide. The California A work has been rising. It was up almost 30% in the last 5 years, but the minimum wage has actually gone up faster in California in the last 5 years than the AWAR has. And the AWAR has gone up fastest in the mountain states like Idaho and Nevada and places like that than in any other area. Next slide. So when we think about H2A workers and US workers, remember H2A, Monterey County has about a fourth. It's the major H2A county. It has about a fourth of the H2A workers in California. And H2A workers are in the United States without their families. They're given housing by their employers, and they are not subject to Social Security or federal unemployment taxes. US workers, on the other hand, usually have to pay rent for the housing that they have, and the rents can be fairly high, especially in coastal areas such as Monterey County. So you can easily see that even if you're earning $15 an hour and working full time, you could give a lot of your earnings for rent. And that's one reason why there's often very crowded housing in coastal areas that have a demand for workers and vegetables and berries, but don't have a big labor supply. Next slide. The H2A program expanded in 2020 during COVID, and it's expanding again in 2021. The data just came out, and usually in the second quarter of the year, about 35% of all jobs for that year are certified. If that rule holds, then the program will expand from 275,000 jobs last year to 334,000 this year. And remember, H2A workers are in the US an average of 6 months. And so what that means is we would go from roughly 110,000 workers to something like 160,000 full-time equivalent workers, and we would be at 15 or 16% of all the average employment being H2A workers. California, the southeastern states like Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina still have most of the jobs, but California and Washington are where the program is expanding the fastest. H2A program is controversial, and the main idea is that H2A workers do cost more than US workers. And it's sometimes said, though, that the cost differences get reduced when you think about how the system works. For H2A workers, the employer is recruiting. We've moved to the H2A's cost $20 to $23. US workers are $15 to $18 an hour. The H2A workers, the employer is selecting the best workers. People often talk about the NFL of pickers. You're selecting 1 out of 5 workers who want to come because, after all, the wages are at least 10 times higher. And those best workers are often used to recruit friends and relatives into the crew and train new hires. US workers select the employer. They can work a few days, they can move on to somebody else. And in some cases, what you wind up getting is workers carpool. And in a berry operation, you might have to hire some 60-year-olds who may be slower pickers in order to get the 30-year-olds with whom they carpool who are very fast workers. So the basic trade-off is H2A workers tend to be younger, they often have higher productivity, and they are loyal, whether you call them loyal or indentured. The idea is they have a contract, so they're not going to go off and work for somebody else. They provide a kind of labor insurance. And the question is, how much is that worth? It seems to be worth something because that's what's helping to make the H2A program expand. And there's a lot of discussion of changing the H2A program further. So next slide, the DOL is considering changes to the H2A program. In July of 2019, the Department of Labor said we're going to go from 1 AWOR per state to having a whole lot of different AWORs for each state. So each occupation or each job title is going to have its own AWOR. Crop workers have one, ag equipment operators have one, livestock workers have one, packers have one, graders have one, etc. They got a lot of comments. Most of them said, no, this is not a good idea. And while DOL was considering all those comments, USDA in September last year said, we're not going to collect data anymore from farmers on how much workers earn. A judge in Fresno said, no, you've got to collect the farm labor survey data. Then in November of 2020, the Department of Labor issued a rule in which it said it's going to freeze the AWORs in 2021 and 2022, and then it's going to adjust them using a different index. Instead of using the Farm Labor Survey, which is data collected from farm employers, it was going to use the Employment Cost Index, which is data collected from non-farm employers. And if Department of Labor had done that, it would have reduced the increase in AWORs. So AWORs were going up about 4% a year. If it had switched the index, it would have cut it in half. And you know, the bottom line is, if you freeze the H2A wage, then you save employers money. So remember, we said the average contract is $12,500 for a 6-month worker. Next slide. And the total 2020 wage bill for H2A workers in the US is about $3.5 billion. So you're saving roughly $140 million a year by freezing the AWOR if it had otherwise gone up by 4%. And then some US workers work alongside those H2A workers, and there's additional savings there. But remember, H2A workers are 10% of average farm employment, and the total wage bill for crop farms is about $31 billion. So the H2A wage bill is only about 1/10 of the total one. And the big question no one knows the answer to is, if you freeze the AWOR, which is, you know, an idea that's been around for quite a while, what would it do to wages for other US workers? And what would happen if we have a state minimum wage that's greater than the AWOR, which is what could happen in some states if the AWOR stays frozen in 2022. So if we go to the next slide, we have a bill that passed the House called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And it's got 3 titles. And that means it does 3 major things. It allows unauthorized workers who did at least 180 days of farm work in the previous 2 years to become what are called certified agricultural workers. And those certified ag workers and their families could become immigrants if the one individual in the family, the certified ag worker, did at least 100 days of farm work in the next 4 or 8 years. 100 days of farm work a year, I should say. But the second item would streamline the H2A program. Workers would get longer visas. They could stay in the United States. They could work for several farm employers. There would be visas for the first time for year-round workers in dairies. And of course, we have this idea of freezing VA work and study, whether it's needed. And then finally, farm employers would have to use E-Verify to check on new hires. So next slide is now we're going to, so we've had labor-saving mechanization, we've had H2A program growing, and changes proposed that would make it grow faster. The third and final topic is, what about trade? Well, it's already true that a half of U.S. fresh fruit and a third of U.S. fresh vegetables are imported. And Mexico is the source of half of the fresh fruit imports and 3/4 of the vegetable imports. So we import a lot of our fresh fruit, a lot of our fresh vegetables, and Mexico is the main source, primarily because we can bring in fruits and vegetables fairly quickly by truck from northern Mexico. Next slide. If you look at Mexico, what's been happening is that many fruits and vegetables in Mexico are grown under what's called protected ag structures, not necessarily greenhouses. It could just be metal hoops with plastic on top. But what happens is in protected ag structures, the plants are protected from both weather and pests, and you get higher yields, longer seasons. It's much easier to grow things organically. And a big change has been that instead of just sending fruits and vegetables from Mexico to the US in the winter months, because of those protected structures, there's been an increase in imports also in the summer months. Next slide. If you go and visit these protected culture structures in Mexico, in many cases, the farms are looking more like factories rather than farms. There's lots of tomato greenhouses, cucumber greenhouses. Most of the berries, strawberries, raspberries, are grown in some kind of structure, which often has controlled entrances and exits. So the workers will have time cards that get stamped as they enter and exit. That means it's easier to track back in case there are problems of any kind. The important point to make is that, next slide, there's roughly 1 million workers employed in Mexican export agriculture. We have 2 million Mexican-born workers in US agriculture, 1 million in Mexico. So the imports of fruits and vegetables are a kind of trade in place of migration. That is, if we imported nothing from Mexico, we would presumably have more Mexican-born workers in the United States working in agriculture. Next slide. The big 3 Mexican fruit and vegetable exports are tomatoes, avocados, and berries. They're over half of all of the Mexican fruits and vegetables that are exported to the U.S. Next slide. And you can see how this works with tomatoes. 60% of the U.S. fresh tomatoes that we consume are imported, and most of those tomatoes come from Mexico. A few come from Canadian greenhouses. And Mexican President Salinas in 1990 was right. He said Mexico can either export tomatoes or tomato pickers to the United States. And clearly, in the case of fresh tomatoes, we are importing the tomatoes rather than the tomato pickers. Next slide. So California has always been a free trade state. California produces commodities worth about $50 billion a year and exports a little over $20 billion worth of those foreign commodities. So 40% of the value of what's produced in California is exported. And it's much higher for individual crops such as almonds. What's been happening is that there are complaints by farmers, typically in Florida, now increasingly in Georgia, about dumping. That is, farmers producing commodities, fruits and vegetables, and selling them in the United States at below the cost of production. More recently, there have been charges that the workers employed on Mexican farms include child labor, include forced labor, and under the USMCA, goods that are produced with child labor or forced labor can be blocked at the border. That is, if growers or someone else complains, the US government can block those imports. So California has always been a free trade state. And the question is, will that change? So if we now go to the last slide, which is the summary, we had 30 years of farm labor abundance between roughly the early 1980s and the 2008-2009 recession. We had a big upsurge of migration from Mexico to the United States. We are now halfway through kind of a time of transition, kind of a race between more migrant guest workers. Remember, with H2A workers getting toward the peak of where braceros were in the 1950s. We have machines. There's been a lot of mechanization. There's a lot more efforts to mechanize that are underway. There are technical issues to solve. We still don't know if consumers are going to accept machine harvested produce. And we don't know whether, for example, supermarkets are going to switch from having conventional and organic produce and maybe have machine harvested and hand harvested produce at different prices. So we have migrants, we have machines, and we have imports. Remember, Mexico is the major source of fresh fruit and vegetable imports, but other countries are also importing more, especially some in Central America, especially northern Peru. Northern Peru has got huge acreages of things like blueberries and avocados, and could wind up becoming a major new source of fruit and vegetable imports. If we look back, the 1960s were a period of switching from bracero workers to US workers. It was the rise of the United Farm Workers, and there was lots of mechanization. Not cannery tomatoes, but also lots of forklifts in the fields and bins replacing lug boxes, etc. In the 2020s, we're moving from unauthorized workers to H2A workers, getting a lot more machines and imports. And the last slide just says, if you want to know more about these things, the Giannini Foundation has put out a new book on California agriculture, which has sections on groups of commodities, so fruits, vegetables, also has a chapter on labor and water. And we try at migration.ucdavis.edu to keep up with little things that are going on. So I apologize again for the inability probably to link the PowerPoint with the talking, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and I hope that despite our technical difficulties, you were able to gain something from this look ahead at farm labor in 2021. So I'll turn it back to Heather and see if I can respond to any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phil. I actually think we had a good amount of success. We received many questions, and yes, there were definitely some times where your slides and your comments were not aligned, but I think that the key messages were transmitted based on the questions that we're getting. So I'm gonna start and ask you about the paperwork associated with H2A workers. The commenter has heard in some years ago that it could be quite a frustrating process to bring workers in time to the US. Has that changed, or has the need increased?
Okay, so the basic idea is that the question always is, when farmers ask for certification to bring in H2A workers, they've usually already identified the H2A workers they want to hire. So in other words, I don't go and apply to the Department of Labor until I've already located the workers that I want to hire. What the government process requires is, the government requires me to go and try to find US workers before I get certified to find H2A workers. You can see how kind of backward that is, because I've already identified these workers in Mexico or elsewhere who I want to hire. And now I've got to go try to find US workers. So the problems start at the very beginning, where US employers don't want to hire any workers who apply. And of course, US workers want a job right now. They don't want a job 30 days from now. They may find something better and then not show up. So there's a great deal of frustration built into the system because the different incentives of employers and the requirements of the government. The government approves, the Department of Labor certifies 98% of all employer applications. So most are approved. It does, the fees to Department of Labor are low. The fees to the Department of Homeland Security and to the Department of State are higher. But most employers use an agent. So there are specialized agents who fill out the paperwork. And I've actually sat with the analyst in Chicago as they take the applications from farm employers, and most of them are not quite rubber stamped, but most of them go through fairly quickly. The new employers getting into the program often make mistakes because the program does have lots of requirements and rules. So if I were a farmer who had never used the H2A program and decided that I was going to do so without using any kind of lawyer or agent, chances are there would be mistakes made and it would something could happen. One of the things that should be emphasized about paperwork is that the employer is offering a contract to do work. And whether a US worker responds or an H2A worker, the employer is expected to fulfill that contract. And some employers do not do so. So the employer is required to have inspected and improved housing. Well, the housing may have been inspected and improved, but then things break and then it no longer passes satisfaction. So many H2A employers say that they are by hiring H2A workers, they put out information about themselves that makes them targets for enforcement. Wage and Hour knows what they promised. Private attorneys know what they promised. And so the argument is often not that the Department of Labor and that the agencies don't do their job, although there were arguments that the Department of State was slow or USCIS was slow to process paperwork. But it's the fear that there could be litigation, because there is a lot of litigation surrounding the H2A program. So it's like many things dealing with government. It's not a program that's easy for individuals to get into on their own, but once individual farmers get into the H2A program, they tend to stay with it, which means they learn how the process works, and many of them expand their employment of H2A workers over time.
Okay, thank you. Sort of a related question. Do employers choose H2A because of higher productivity, or because those workers are much less likely to complain about working conditions given their desire to be called back in subsequent years?
Well, I think it's all of the above. They are younger. They tend to work faster. They are loyal. They're not going to go work for your neighbor who's paying a nickel more. They do want to please the employer and be invited back next year. So it's in a sense, some people contrast sort of the attitude difference. The H2A worker is in the U.S. to please the employer and be invited back next year, also to maximize his or her earnings. The U.S. worker may be looking for a better job, may be looking for a non-farm job that offers more opportunity for advancement or year-round work or benefits, whereas the H2A worker really just wants to please the employer and be invited to return to pick peaches again next year. So this is true in any guest worker program for low-skilled workers. And this would be exactly the same thing, whether we were talking about caregivers and for the elderly or for children. The guest workers are in the country earning a wage that's 5 or 10 times higher than they could earn at home. If it's seasonal, they want to be invited back next year. The U.S. worker who's filling the job may be looking for something else that pays more, that gives more opportunities. So there is going to be an attitude difference typically between guest workers and local workers.
Okay, thank you. If the minimum wage is higher than the AWER, why would the minimum wage not be required? So sort of projecting forward a few years.
Okay, I'm sorry. It would be required.
Okay.
Employers have to pay the higher of the minimum wage, the AWER wage, the prevailing wage, or a collective bargaining wage. I mean, the employer makes 17 promises in their application, one of which is to pay the highest of those wages. Until now, the AWER has always been the highest.
Okay.
But it may not be in the future.
Thanks for clarifying. Okay, are there any data on workplace injuries and illnesses between H2A workers and non-H2A?
Well, this is something that really we should look at. I don't know of any such data, but there are several things that would say this is an important area to look at. H2A workers are often more concentrated in harvesting than are U.S. workers. Harvesting often pays piece rate wages, and piece rate wages are offered when it's hard to monitor worker effort, but easy to monitor worker output. So I can't see you picking apples in a tree, but I can count how many bins of apples you picked. And under piece rate systems, workers earn more than whatever the guaranteed minimum is, the minimum wage or the AWER, but they have an incentive to work fast. And if they're on ladders, there could be injuries because it's often said that with piece rate workers, this tendency to go fast not only has quality implications, but also can lead to injuries. So with the concentration of young workers who may be more willing to take risk and being concentrated in harvesting, there could be more injuries than among typical U.S. workers, who would include a higher share of irrigators and other non-harvest workers. But I don't know of any data, and I think that would be, when injuries are reported, as far as I know, they're not reported by whether the worker has an H2A visa or not.
Great, thank you. Okay, let me see. So you did talk about the COVID pandemic and the way that it accelerated some of the already existing changes to ag employment, but could you summarize that once again, sort of how do you see the resolution of COVID changing ag employment moving forward?
Well, as I said, I think what most economists say is COVID accelerates change that was already underway. So it was already true that we were doing more remote work. It was already true before COVID that there was a push for telemedicine, for example. COVID accelerated that. You often read in economics and labor market literature that COVID compressed what could have occurred over 10 years into 1 year. This whole idea of Zoom instead of going to meetings, the whole idea of sending the x-rays to India to be analyzed instead of doing it here in person, et cetera. And the same is true in agriculture. But of course, it wasn't just, everything speeded up, but it's not always in the same direction. So the labor saving mechanization means you replace workers with machines, or with mechanic wage, you make the hand workers more productive, take some of the lifting and carrying out. But it also meant more H2A workers. And we can talk a lot about why the H2A program expanded in a year when there was a lot of unemployment in the United States. And whether the answer is that the US workers had other options that made them stay away from farm work, or whether the answer is that the H2A workers, because they were housed by employers, could be more easily managed so that you could minimize COVID. Whatever it is, we, the fact that the guest worker program expanded in a year of high unemployment, and I might add, not just in the United States, it happened in Canada, it happened in Western Europe. So it was across all the industrial countries that despite very high unemployment in the food system, especially in restaurants and hospitality, we did not move workers from restaurants into fields in any significant numbers. Even in countries like France that made a major effort to get unemployed urban people out in the fields, it didn't really happen. Instead, in countries from Germany to the UK to the US, the admission of guest workers went up. And as I say, you could debate for many, many hours as to why that happened. But I do think, once again, it accelerated a change already underway, and it's likely to continue. That third one about imports rising, that's also one that I don't know how will play out. I mean, I think it's important to point out that California, which has always been a free trader, is now starting to get some commodities that are looking to restrict imports. So Coachella Valley table grape growers are looking to restrict imports from Mexico because Coachella table grapes normally got a very high price coming early in the season, but now Mexican grapes from Sonora are kind of coming in longer and longer every year, and that puts a lid on the prices that California growers can get. So I don't know how those, but I think if you keep those three balls juggling in the air, mechanization, guest workers, and imports, those three are going to be very important in determining how the farm labor market evolves in California.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question because I'm really interested in the answer, and then I think we're going to wrap up. What percentage of H2A workers come via FLCs versus growers? And then are they considered joint employers under MISPA?
Okay, so good question. And the answer is nationally, about 40% of H2A workers come via labor contractors. And in general, it depends, the joint liability depends on part on how the arrangements are structured. So I, as a farm labor contractor, cannot get H2A workers until I've got an agreement with you that I'm going to harvest the crops on your farm. California and Florida are labor contractor models. So in California and Florida, most H2As are employed by contractors. And it's probably important to point out, the contractors are not a contractor with a pickup truck. These are contractors who own buses, who own trucks, who have housing for workers. Sometimes they own motels. So they're well capitalized. They're more like temp agencies with equipment. In North Carolina and Washington, with some of the other big states, it's much more employer associations who bring workers in, H2A workers in, send them out to smaller farms, and in some cases are joint employers with the farms. Most of the big labor contractors in California and in Florida would be technically called custom harvesters. So that under California and federal labor law, they would be solely liable for any labor law violations, not the farm where they were working. The analogy is to you hiring a painter to paint your house. That painter brings workers, and your agreement is with the painter, and you're not liable as a homeowner if the painter doesn't pay his or her workers. That's usually the arrangement with the largest custom harvesters and the bigger labor contractors.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Martin, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. I think that we have demonstrated how adept we can be at pivoting in the moment, and I think this was a success. I hope it was for all of you. Please consider signing up for our newsletter, and we hope to see you next month for our last seminar of the season. Again, thank you, Dr. Martin, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you, and thank everybody who participated.
Bye.